3 orphan sisters were being auctioned off with their father's barren land, and the only bid was a cruel joke until a quiet man stepped out of the shadows. Scene start. Location: Redemption Gulch, Montana Territory. Season: late autumn. Year: 1878. The sun bled a weak, watery orange across the hard-pound dirt of the town square. It offered no warmth, only a harsh glare that illuminated the shame on Elara Vance's face. She stood on the splintered steps of the town hall, a living ghost flanked by her 2 younger sisters. At 20, she was the guardian, the mother, the shield, but today she felt like a sacrifice. Before them, a crowd of familiar faces had curdled into a mob of detached curiosity and cold judgment. Her sisters, Sarah and Clara, clung to the back of her faded calico dress, their small bodies trembling against hers. Clara, the youngest, had her face buried in the fabric, clutching a wooden doll so worn it was more memory than toy. Sarah, her jaw set with a child's brittle defiance, stared straight ahead, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Jedediah Kane, the town banker, stood beside them, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He held up the deed to the Vance homestead, a piece of paper that represented a lifetime of her father's sweat and a season of his failure. "The deed comes with the debt," Kane announced, his voice slick with false piety. "And the burdens. 100 acres of dust and rock, and these 3-inch," he gestured to them as if they were livestock. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. A man in the front row laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "What's the bid for 3 more mouths to feed?" he crowed. Kane's smile widened. This was the moment of breaking. The ultimate humiliation he had engineered. He wanted the land for nothing, and he wanted the Vances gone, a blight erased from his tidy ledger. Elara closed her eyes, her spirit shrinking to a tiny, hard point inside her chest. She had promised her mother on her deathbed. She had promised she would keep them together. Now, the promise was turning to ash in her mouth. She could feel the stares, the pity, the scorn. This was the end of the line. From the back of the crowd, a voice, quiet but carrying the weight of iron, cut through the noise. $100. Every head turned. He stood near the livery, a silhouette against the dying light. Elias Thorne. A man who lived on the edge of the territory and the edge of their society, a widower who spoke more to his horses than to any person. He was tall and broad, his face a mask of old grief chiseled by sun and wind. He wore the quiet severity of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He moved forward, his steps deliberate, parting the crowd like a ship through water. He stopped before Kane, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, not on the banker, but on Elara. He saw her. Not the burden, not the shame, but the defiant tremor in her chin, the fierce, protective arch of her back as she shielded her sisters. For a fleeting second, he saw the abyss in her eyes, a void he knew intimately. Kane blinked, momentarily thrown. 100? Thorne, the debt is 500. This is no time for charity. Elias's gaze didn't waver from Elara. "I am not a charitable man." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch, tossing it onto the steps. It landed with a heavy, final thud of gold coin. "That's 500. For the land." "And for them," he said it like a verdict. "They are part of the deed now." The crowd was silent, stunned. Kane, his face flushing with anger at being outmaneuvered, snatched the pouch. He couldn't refuse a paid debt. He shoved the deed into Elias's hand. "They're your problem now, Thorne. Don't come crying to me when they starve." Elias ignored him. He looked at Elara, then knelt, his movement stiff, until he was at eye level with the 2 small girls hiding behind her. "It's time to go home," he said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. The journey was made in a silence as vast as the plains around them. The wagon jolted over the rutted track, heading away from the town lights and into the deepening twilight. Elara sat stiffly on the buckboard beside Elias, her hands clenched in her lap. The girls were huddled in the back, wrapped in a coarse blanket he had given them. For the first hour, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wheels and the weary sigh of the horses. Elara kept stealing glances at the man beside her. His face was unreadable, his profile stark against the horizon. He hadn't bought a wife. He hadn't bought servants. He had bought, what? A responsibility? A penance? Her mind reeled. As the moon rose, a tiny voice piped up from the wagon bed. It was Sarah, her voice thin with hunger and fear. "Elara," she whispered. "Are we going to be all right?" Elara couldn't answer. The truth was a stone in her throat. Then, Sarah's voice came again, smaller this time, a desperate piece of logic only a child could conjure. "It's okay if there's no food," she said, trying to be brave. "We can eat grass." Pa said the cows do it. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but Elara saw his jaw clench, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He had heard. He had heard the sound of hope so broken it was grasping at weeds. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the devastating innocence of that single, whispered sentence. It was the sound of rock bottom. Scene start. Location, Elias Thorne's homestead, Cedar Creek. Season, first snow of winter. Year, 1878. They arrived well after midnight, under a sky crowded with cold, indifferent stars. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the world in a fragile layer of white. Elias's homestead was nestled in a shallow valley, protected by a stand of ancient cedars. A simple, sturdy log cabin stood dark against the snow, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a prayer. It was a place of profound solitude. As Elias reined in the horses, the cabin door opened, spilling a warm, yellow light onto the ground. An old dog, a grey-muzzled hound, padded out, its tail giving a single, tentative wag. Elias swung down from the wagon and went to the back. He didn't ask Elara for help, he simply lifted a sleeping Clara into his arms, blanket and all, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. He carried her inside as if she weighed nothing. Elara, her limbs stiff and frozen, helped Sarah clamber down. They followed him into the cabin, blinking in the sudden warmth and light. The inside was one large room, meticulously clean and ordered. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A simple meal of bread and stew was waiting on the table, a pot of something steaming over the fire. It was a home, not just a shelter. It was cared for, lived in, yet it carried an echo of emptiness, a silence that spoke of profound loss. On a small mantelpiece, a faded daguerreotype of a smiling woman holding a baby caught Elara's eye. Beside it, on a small, separate plot of land visible from the window, two simple wooden crosses stood against the snow. The graves were small, one heartbreakingly so. Elias's past was not a secret, it was a quiet, permanent resident in this house. He laid Clara down on a cot near the fire, pulling the blankets up to her chin. He looked at Elara and Sarah, who stood frozen by the door. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command born of a deep, unspoken understanding of their hunger. "There is more," he gestured to the pot. Sarah, her fear momentarily forgotten in the face of the savory smell, scurried to the table. Elara hesitated, her pride a stubborn, useless thing. We can't repay you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Elias turned from stoking the fire, his gaze steady. "I didn't ask for repayment." He ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her. His hands were calloused and scarred, but his movements were careful. "This is your home now," he stated, the words hanging in the air with the weight of a vow. "The work will be hard. But you won't be hungry. You won't be cold." He spoke in facts, not reassurances. It was all he could offer. Elara finally sat, her body surrendering to exhaustion and the undeniable warmth of the stew. It was the first truly hot meal she'd had in months. As she ate, she watched him. He moved with a quiet economy, checking on the horses, banking the fire for the night, ensuring the cabin was secure against the wind that had begun to howl outside. He was a man accustomed to solitude, yet he was seamlessly, silently, making room for them. Later, as the girls slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Elara lay awake on a fresh pallet of hay and blankets he had prepared for them. The storm raged outside, but inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of her sisters. She looked at the sturdy log walls, the solid roof. She thought of Cain's sneering face, of the town that had cast them out. And then she looked at the broad back of Elias Thorne, who sat in a chair by the fire, a rifle across his lap, keeping watch. He was a stranger. A man of sorrows. He had bought her sisters, their worthless land. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, Ilara felt a strange and fragile sensation. It was not hope. It was not trust. It was something far simpler and more profound. It was the feeling of a lock turning, of a heavy door, long bolted against the world, creaking open just a crack. It was the feeling of being safe. Scene start. Location, Elias Thorne's homestead, Cedar Creek. Season, deep winter turning to spring. Year, 1879. Winter locked them in its icy embrace. The world shrank to the cabin, the barn, and the short, breathless path between them. The days fell into a quiet, rhythmic pattern dictated by necessity and survival. Elias was a creature of routine. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake the children. He would tend the livestock, chop wood, and clear paths through the snow that fell almost daily. At first, Ilara and the girls were simply observers, shadows in his well-worn life. But slowly, a silent partnership began to form. Ilara took over the cabin, transforming it. She learned the quirks of the wood stove, patched the girls' threadbare dresses with scraps of flour sacking, and stretched their supplies with a frugal ingenuity born of long practice. She found a rhythm in kneading bread, her hands, once raw from laundry, growing strong and capable again. There were no grand conversations, only a language of shared tasks. When Elias came in from the cold, his coat dusted with snow, she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting. When she saw him struggling to mend a torn leather harness, she would silently retrieve her needle and waxed thread and repair it with small, perfect stitches. He never said thank you, but the next day, a freshly cut stack of firewood would be piled neatly by the cabin door. The healing was as slow and quiet as the winter thaw. It happened in the small moments. Elias, seeing little Clara's worn doll, spent an evening carving a new one from a block of cedar. He presented it to her without a word, simply placing it in her small hands. Clara, who had barely spoken since their arrival, looked at the new doll, then up at Elias's stern face, and whispered a tiny, perfect, thank you. It was the first time they had seen Elias's mouth soften into something that was almost a smile. Sarah, brave and practical, became his shadow in the barn. He taught her how to milk their single cow, how to check the chicken coop for eggs, his large, rough hands guiding her small ones. He spoke to her in his usual direct way, explaining the why of things, and she soaked it all in, her fear of this silent giant slowly replaced by a fierce, childish loyalty. He was teaching them not just to survive, but to build. One afternoon, as a Chinook wind whispered of the coming spring, Ilara was mending one of Elias's shirts. The fabric was worn thin at the elbow, a testament to years of hard labor. As her needle moved in and out, she felt him watching her. She looked up and met his gaze. There was an intensity in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a quiet awe. In that shared glance, something shifted. It was no longer about gratitude or safety. It was about seeing. He saw her resilience, her quiet dignity. She saw his deep, guarded loneliness, the cracks in his stoic facade. "My wife, Mary," he said, his voice a low rumble, breaking the comfortable silence. She had a way with a needle. Could make something beautiful from nothing. Ilara's fingers stilled on the fabric. It was the first time he had mentioned her. "The crosses," she started, her own voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the window and the two snow-dusted markers beyond. "Fever. Took her and our son, Daniel. Happened fast." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The grief was a living thing in the room, a presence she now understood was the foundation of his silence. She looked down at the shirt in her hands, at the neat rows of her stitches pulling the worn fabric together. She was mending more than a shirt. They were all mending, patching the holes in each other's lives with quiet acts of care. That evening, as the sun set, casting a pink glow on the melting snow, Elara took a small packet of seeds from her pocket, marigold seeds she had saved from her mother's garden, a tiny piece of her past she had clung to. She went to the small, protected patch of earth by the cabin door. Elias came out and stood behind her. He watched as she knelt and, with her bare hands, cleared a small space in the thawing soil and planted the seeds. "They might not take," he said, his voice gentle. "The ground is still cold." Elara looked up at him, her face illuminated by the last light of day. A genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. "I know," she said, her voice full of a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. "But I have to try." He simply nodded, understanding that she wasn't just planting flowers. She was planting hope. Scene start. Location: Elias Thorne's homestead and Vance property. Season: late spring. Year: 1879. Spring arrived not as a whisper, but as a roar. The creek swelled with melted snow, the aspens turned a vibrant green, and the earth, soft and dark, smelled of new life. The seeds of hope Elara had planted had taken root, both in the ground and in the small family forged by winter. The marigolds pushed stubborn green shoots toward the sun. The girls' laughter, once a rarity, now echoed through the valley. Elias had started working the land, not just his own fertile fields, but the rocky 100 acres that had once belonged to the Vances. He blasted rock and cleared scrub, his body a testament to relentless effort. He was turning their father's failure into a future. Elara worked alongside him, her hands in the soil, planting the vegetable garden that would sustain them. They moved in a comfortable, unspoken rhythm, a partnership forged in silence and solidified in shared labor. One afternoon, as they rested by the creek, Sarah ran to them, her face beaming, holding up a small, glistening rock. "Look what I found." Elias took it, turning it over in his palm. A flicker of something, not gold, but close, ran through the quartz. Pyrite. Fool's gold. But there was something else there, a deeper vein of color. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the rocky outcrop where Sarah had found it. His expression hardened. He had seen formations like this before, in the war, in places men fought and died over. It was the kind of rock that often hid something more valuable. That was the day the world intruded. A wagon rattled up their private track, unannounced. Jedediah Kane sat on the seat, a smug smile on his face. Beside him were two hired men, their faces hard and impatient. Kane held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of victory. "Thorne," he called out, his voice echoing with false authority. "A slight miscalculation in our previous transaction." Elias rose slowly, placing himself between Kane and Elara. His body went rigid, his hands hanging loose at his sides. It was the stance of a soldier bracing for impact. Elara gathered the children behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The original deed for the Vance property," Kane began, dismounting from his wagon, "was contingent upon the land being unimproved. Your work here, a blasting, clearing, constitutes a breach of that unwritten town covenant. It was a lie, a fabrication spun from greed. The town council, of which I am the head, has voted to reclaim the property. It will be sold to a more suitable party." He meant himself. His eyes darted around, lingering on the freshly cleared fields, the new fences, the signs of silver or in the blasted rock he'd heard rumors of. Elara felt a cold dread wash over her. He was here to take it all away. To shatter the fragile peace they had built. "The debt was paid," Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. "The deed is mine, a deed you acquired under false pretenses, hiding your intent to develop," Kane sneered. "These are my lands now. Get off." He gestured to his men, who took a step forward. This was the moment. The confrontation they had all been dreading. The past, in all its cruelty, had come for them. Elias didn't move. He stood like one of the ancient cedars, immovable. But then, something unexpected happened. Elara stepped out from behind him. She moved to stand at his side, her small frame straight and unbowed. She looked directly at Jedediah Kane, the man who had tried to break her, and she found her voice. It was not loud. It was not pleading. It was clear and steady, forged in the fire of a long, hard winter. "You will not take our home," she said. The words were simple, but they held the power of a revelation. "Our home?" Cain scoffed. "You have no say here, girl. You are nothing but charity." He picked up from the gutter. Elias's hand twitched, but Elara laid a calming hand on his arm. She kept her eyes on Cain. "I am Elara Vance," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "This was my father's land. Now it is our land. Mine. My sister's." And she tilted her head toward Elias. "We built this. With our own hands. And you, a man who preys on orphans and hides behind false laws, you have no power here. This is a place of honesty and hard work. You do not belong." A stunned silence followed. Cain stared at her, his jaw slack. He had expected a cowering victim, not this defiant woman. He had come to fight a lone, broken man, but he was facing a family. Scene start. Location: Elias Thorne's homestead, Cedar Creek. Season: high summer. Year: 1879. Jedediah Cain's arrogance faltered, replaced by a venomous rage. He saw not a family, but an obstacle. The sight of Elara, no longer broken but standing as an equal beside the formidable Thorne, was an insult to the order he believed in. "I have the law on my side," he spat, recovering his composure. He turned to his hired men. "Remove them." The two men hesitated. They were bullies, not fighters, and there was a quality to Elias Thorne's stillness that promised swift and terrible violence. He hadn't drawn a weapon, but he looked like one. As they took another reluctant step forward, a new sound joined the tense standoff, the jingle of harnesses and the heavy tread of horses. A half-dozen riders crested the hill, farmers and ranchers from the surrounding valleys. They were grim-faced men who rarely came to town, men who, like Elias, valued solitude and hard work. They had heard whispers of Cain's greed, of the quiet widower who had taken in 3 orphans, of the banker trying to steal land he had already been paid for. They sat on their horses, a silent jury, their presence a clear and unspoken verdict against Cain. Cain's face went pale. He could intimidate a lone man or a broken girl. He could bully a town council. But he could not fight the entire territory. These men represented a different kind of law, one written in sweat, honor, and mutual respect. Defeated, his bluff called, he snatched the reins of his wagon. "This isn't over, Thorne," he hissed, his threat sounding hollow and pathetic. He scrambled onto his wagon and whipped his horses into a frantic retreat, his hired men scurrying after him like dogs. They vanished over the rise, leaving only a cloud of dust and the profound, ringing silence of their departure. The ranchers gave Elias a slow, respectful nod, then turned their horses and rode away as quietly as they had come. No words were needed. The crisis had passed. Elara, Elias, and the girl stood alone in the sudden quiet, the afternoon sun warming their faces. The air felt clean again. Elara's legs suddenly felt weak, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. She leaned against Elias for support, and his arm came around her, holding her steady. It was the first time they had touched with such familiarity, such intimacy. It felt less like a beginning and more like a long-overdue arrival. He held her for a long moment, the warmth of his hand on her arm a silent affirmation. He then released her and walked to his saddlebags, which were slung over a fence post. He retrieved 2 pieces of paper. One was the deed to his own homestead. The other was the deed Cain had thrown at him, the deed to the Vance land. He held them both out to her. "A house divided cannot stand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is all one place now. It is ours." Elara looked from the papers to his face. She saw the truth of his words in his steady gaze. He wasn't giving her charity. He was offering her a partnership. A future. She took the deeds, her fingers tracing the names written on them, Thorne, Vance. She slid them together, making them one. Then, she looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears she no longer had to hide. Ours, she agreed, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy. Epilogue. 5 years later. The sun, a benevolent gold, spilled across a valley teeming with life. The two homesteads had merged seamlessly. A larger, expanded cabin stood where the original had been, with smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Fields of wheat swayed in the summer breeze, and the rocky patch of land that had once been a symbol of failure now held a small, prosperous silver mine, its profits used to secure their future and help their neighbors. Elias, his face softer now, etched with laugh lines instead of grief, stood on the porch, his arm around Elara. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe bun, now fell softly around her shoulders. She leaned against him, a picture of serene contentment. Below them, in the meadow filled with blooming marigolds, 3 girls played. Sarah, now a confident teenager, was teaching a much younger boy, their son, Daniel, how to skip stones across the creek. Clara, no longer a silent waif, was reading a book in the shade of a cedar tree, her laughter bright and easy. Their home was not quiet anymore. It was filled with the sounds of life, of work, of love. Elias looked down at Elara, his thumb gently stroking her hand. He had stepped out of the shadows that day in town to save 3 orphans from a cruel fate. But now he knew the truth. They, in their quiet strength and desperate hope, had been the ones to save him. They had led him out of the winter of his own heart and into the warmth of the sun. If this story of how a broken family was mended by quiet kindness and defiant courage stirred your heart, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more tales of redemption, and share in the comments how the power of compassion has made a difference in your own life. Join our community, and let's continue to celebrate the stories that remind us that even in the harshest wilderness, hope can build a home.